Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams. And we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And we're just going to, abbreviate that to OBBA because that's quite a mouthful. And what we're going to do is break down the impact of this bill on mineral and royalty owners and what you can expect going forward as a result of this legislation that was just signed into law.
You said it, man, and the name is fitting. There's a ton here to talk about with energy and other sectors, but yeah, a lot of changes that we'll see how it makes a difference.
Yeah, we'll see at the end of the day, but seems to certainly go contrary to the Inflation Reduction Act, another kind of absurdly named bill, just like One Big Beautiful Bill, which is, I guess, fitting for President Trump, naming that. But as far as the direction that we were headed in the previous administration, obviously it was indexed towards more renewables. So there was lots of credits for things like hydrogen, solar, wind, and all those types of technologies. And I guess not too surprising based on the campaign policies and what Trump has said quite a bit that he wants to drill, baby, drill. And this bill certainly, lines up with that statement. So there's definitely indexed on the opposite direction towards more traditional fossil fuels. Now, it does have some things in there, which we'll talk about as well, related to other energy forms, just not wind and solar and CO2 sequestration as much as it was before. So, Justin, you want to talk about sort of the high points here? I think we'll dive into some of the specifics as it relates to impacts directly to oil and gas development, and then the trickle-down effects on mineral and royalty owners. So we'll break that down so you can understand if this bill will directly impact you, or some of the provisions in here that might just affect all mineral and royalty owners, maybe directly or indirectly, and we'll talk about that as well.
Absolutely, Matt. And like we usually talk about when it comes to bills like this, it mostly impacts federal leasing. On top of that, the bill really goes into some different incentives for operators that they can take advantage of to sweeten the deal. And the first thing here, Matt, is that they have made mandatory quarterly federal lease sales. And this is in the 9 biggest states. And Matt, this will open up areas for operators to develop, and then mineral owners that have adjacent private minerals could really benefit from that. And this was something a year ago or 2 years ago, the Biden administration wasn't allowing any sales, and this was a big point of contention. So not surprising to see this topic in here.
Yeah, not surprising to see them reverse this. And I think this is good because the allowing of responsible development of federal minerals, having a NEPA analysis, having environmental analysis, which we'll talk about that's changing as well, but having a process and streamlining it to allow operators to proceed with responsibly developing federal minerals is a direct benefit to mineral and royalty owners that own private minerals adjacent to those federal minerals that now hopefully will get leased and developed. So with the prior administration, they blocked those federal lease sales and they prevented new permits. And if you own, let me give a couple examples of areas where this is really a big issue. And I'd say New Mexico is probably the area with the most activity right now that has a patchwork of state, federal, and private mineral rights. And in those situations where they need to pool together minerals over, say, 2 sections of land or 3 sections of land that contain a mix of those different ownership types, if you own private minerals in an area where there are federal minerals and they're not holding any lease sales, they're not allowing permits, well, that means that your minerals are not going to get developed either, because operators need to pool those different tracts together and form a federal drilling unit in order to move forward with developing those, federal minerals that they leased. And what it means is if they are able to lease those federal minerals adjacent to your mineral rights, that you would hopefully see them lease your private minerals and then develop them, and you get paid royalties. And those quarterly lease sales, it mandates those going forward, which kind of goes back to the way things were historically. And they mentioned 9 major energy producing states: Wyoming, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Montana, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Nevada, and Alaska. And it mandates that the BLM must now offer at least 50% of all nominated parcels that are eligible for leasing. And any eligible parcel nominated for leasing must be put up for auction within 18 months. So it really accelerates that whole leasing process. And again, like we said, this matters for private mineral and royalty owners because of modern drilling, particularly where they're using horizontal drilling to go across multiple mineral tracts. It requires them to lease large swaths of contiguous acreage in order for them to move forward with the development. And they need to do that for more than just one well, right? They need to have an area to where they can fully develop that drilling unit. And so that means that they need to be able to access the state, the federal, and the private minerals and get leases for that in order to move forward. So I think this is probably one of the biggest direct impacts to mineral and royalty owners that have minerals in those states that I just mentioned. Again, if you're in an area near where there are federal mineral rights, this could have a direct impact on you. Again, just because it opens up that land that was previously not available to operators. And then as a result of that, hopefully you will get the opportunity to lease your minerals as well. So that's definitely something to pay attention to and monitor those federal lease sales and see what acreage that they're nominating, and then how that might affect you directly.
You said it, Matt. And along with that, on federal lands, the Inflation Reduction Act had set the minimum federal royalty rate at 16.67% for both onshore and offshore production. And this new bill reverses it and brings the federal royalty rate back to the previous range of 12.5 to 16.67%, with 12.5% being the new minimum. So that is also a change that happened on the federal lands. And it's really just an effort to try to spur operators to begin drilling again. And there's some other things too that they're doing that may make a huge difference.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that will directly impact the economics of these wells. So, coupled with allowing them to lease these minerals in these areas, if there's a large percentage of federal minerals and they're able to get, even at 16.67% royalty, that's lower than they'd be able to lease the fee minerals in that area. Typically, you'd be looking for 3/16 royalty or up to 25%. So that's 18.75% to 25% royalty. So what it means is they get to keep a larger percentage of that revenue that comes in, when they drill these new wells. So that just, further increases and benefits the economics of these projects. So it's really driving and really wanting to attract drilling on federal lands. That one thing, they're changing that minimum royalty rate has a direct impact on the economics. I think this is just another thing that if you have minerals in that area where there are federal units and federal leases, then this is going to be a big benefit and hopefully attracting additional drilling and getting your minerals developed. So yeah, I think that's definitely a bonus for mineral owners in those areas.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. And I would imagine it's going to have a wonderful effect on the surrounding private minerals as well, because in that economic situation, the operators can pay more to the private owners because they are getting such a good deal with the federal lands. So it just makes a lot of sense economic-wise for the operators, for the mineral owners. It'd be interesting to see if it has an impact on property values.
Ooh, that's a good point. Yeah, I definitely would be curious to see, how does that directly affect the leasing rates? The projection by the Department of Interior was that it could lead to around 225 additional federal leases in 2026 alone, and over the following years, an average of 160 additional wells drilled on those new leases. So yeah, I think it's all positive from that standpoint if you are a mineral owner in those areas.
All right, man. So for the operators, another thing that they did is they changed the intangible drilling cost. Matt, we talk a lot about how expensive it is to drill an oil well. The operators are fully aware of this, and they're going to take any advantage they can when it comes from a tax perspective. And the big change for those of us that aren't more accounting fluent was that they could deduct this all within the same year, where previously over multiple years, they had to kind of split up the costs for drilling these wells, which is a huge economic impact. And Matt, I would imagine for oil and gas companies, this completely changes the formula that they're using to determine whether this is a profitable situation that they're going to go into. From your perspective and your experience, and what's happening inside the companies right now, I mean, is this a big win for them?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it doesn't change the before tax cost to drill and complete a well, right? So it's still going to cost, if it's $10 million, if it was $10 million before this was signed into law, it's still going to be $10 million. But what, like Justin said, it allows these companies to do, instead of having to amortize that over multiple years, like the Inflation Reduction Act required, it sort of restricted the ability to expense those intangible drilling costs. So the companies have always been able to, or at least for a number of years, been able to expense the intangible drilling costs associated with these new wells. And what we mean by intangible drilling costs, it's the things that aren't left in the ground when they're done. So tangible costs are things like pumps, tanks, wellhead equipment, pipe, things that have lasting, intrinsic value. Intangible costs are everything else, basically. It's the labor, the fuel, the drilling mud, the site preparation, and all the work that, once the crew's gone, that, there's not real evidence that you spent money on those things other than the fact that there's something there that's built and working. So those intangible costs, they can, represent around 60% or maybe up to 80% on the high side of the total cost of drilling a well. And what this deduction allows it to do is it's really just a tax benefit for these companies to incentivize them to drill additional wells, right? And the reason this was all put into place in the first place was because of the risk. When you drill a new well, there's a chance that it is not productive. And so allowing companies to expense these things in the year that they incurred, gives them a little bit of a tax break, offsets other income. And so this is what this will allow it to do. And again, when you take it after tax, on an after tax basis, I think it would help the economics of these projects. Again, all of these are things that are just, small little incremental benefits to the companies that are taking the risk to spend the capital to drill the wells and to get the production up and running. So yeah, I think it's big because it makes drilling new wells more attractive to operators. And again, if these areas, especially as we're getting into tier 2 and tier 3 acreage where the economics aren't quite as good now as it was, 5 or 10 years ago in these shale basins, it is opening up and making these less economic wells more attractive now. So I think some of these things are all a benefit ultimately to mineral and royalty owners indirectly, just because it's going to spur hopefully some additional drilling in your area, and it could mean that you'll again get more royalties as these new wells come online. Now, the thing that you have to keep in mind is if you are actually investing in non-operated working interests, this could have a direct impact on you. So that's another side that's, I'd say more sophisticated or large family offices, have some mix of minerals and royalties as well as non-operated working interests. And again, if you're a non-operated working interest owner that you participate in the drilling of a new well, this is a direct benefit to you because again, it allows you to, deduct those expenses in the year that they were incurred. Now, all along, all this stuff we're talking about, this is our layperson view of this huge bill. And so we may have missed some of the nuances. So as always, don't consider this tax, legal, or financial advice. Get with your financial advisor, your CPA, your attorney to get advice specific to your situation. But just talking in general terms, I think this is a big win for oil and gas companies.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. And, something I thought that was interesting was the way that they did this. And again, we're not experts on this, so please take this at face value. And those that are experts may completely understand this in a different way. But they adjusted the financial statement income for the corporate alternative minimum tax. And so it essentially ensures that even the really large companies paying the alternative minimum tax can benefit from these deductions. And to me, Matt, that's really a sign that they were targeting the people who had the money to make the investment now. And that's really kind of their hope. But I wonder how much of an impact from the oil and gas standpoint, the fear that this is political, that Trump will be out of office in a few years, and that this could change, and what impact that's going to have on the decisions they make in this. Is there going to be a big boom because they want to take advantage? We'll see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I think, certainly in the next couple of years, you'd expect this to stay in place. And so to the extent that they're maybe saving 10 or 15%, on the cost or the economics of these wells, maybe that means that 10 or 15% more wells can get drilled over the next couple of years, say 2 to 3 years while Trump is in office. To your point, when he leaves, all bets are off. And if the political tides swing the other direction again, then I would expect this all to get reversed and backed out. And so, it's kind of like this seesaw effect, right? Depending on which political parties in power, they, go to their favored form of energy. And so it's not great long term. It'd be good to see more steady and less of these big swings one way or the other. But yeah, it is what it is. And so I guess for the next couple of years, this is a potential benefit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is certainly a benefit. All right. And another benefit is the estate tax. So not only was this changed, which has been happening quite a bit in the last few cycles politically, but it's been set and indexed for inflation going forward. It represents a massive increase from the previous 13.99 million, and it's been permanently set at 15 million per person, Matt, which is going to be great for mineral owners due to the real property. I wonder if it'll stick. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really interesting because we talked about this in the past, and we'll link to some of those episodes where we mentioned the estate tax exemption, and the concern was, some of those limits that were set to sunset here in the next couple of years and drop back significantly to, I think, around like $5 million per person. It says it's permanent, right? But of course, additional legislation could be passed in the future that could change it. But for now, they permanently set it. So there's no end date as it's written right now. So it's that $15 million per person or $30 million for married couples. And so if you were on the bubble there before, there was a serious concern of, from a estate planning point of view, what do you need to do to start to take advantage of to get that estate down below that limit so you don't have to pay estate taxes? Now this, by raising that ceiling, so to speak, it really opens it up to where, you're not pressured to have to sell and liquidate assets and to shuffle things around. So if you have a large mineral portfolio, it would provide some additional flexibility, I think, in terms of, not having to sell minerals to pay estate taxes when somebody passes away, because ultimately they're going to tax it on the value as of the date of death. And it could mean that you need to sell that to pay this massive tax bill. If you have a estate that was, $15 million and you're above the limit, you have to pay your estate tax portion. So that's a huge benefit. I think if you have a large mineral portfolio, again, it really gives you some breathing room, and there would be zero estate tax if you're below the limit, right? So that's a really big, I think, sigh of relief for those families looking to pass that wealth on to the next generation. So from a multi-generational planning standpoint, obviously you want to get with your financial advisor and look at how this bill is going to impact you going forward. And it may open up some different avenues and eliminate some things you maybe were considering in the past. So that's a definite change that affects really all people. This is not just mineral and royalty owners. This is, regardless of what your different types of assets in that estate. But if you, again, had a estate that was near that limit, there was a chance you were having to pay estate taxes in the past. Now that's sort of set in stone, which is, I think, a sigh of relief.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. And I think it'll be really great to see that and the predictability that it creates for foreseeable futures. Another thing kind of in this mix was the creation of the Trump accounts, is what they're called, which this is a tax-deferred saving account for children born between December 1st, 2025 and December 31st, 2028. The federal government will contribute $1,000 to these accounts, and then parents can contribute up to $5,000 annually, and these earnings grow tax-deferred. Matt, I think this was an attempt to do several things. One, put some money into the economy in the future. Two, help encourage the birth of children and population growth. So it'll be interesting to see what impact this has. I don't know if this has been done before quite in this way, but I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of like the STEMI checks. This kind of reminds me of that in the post-COVID time period. Hey, it was signed by the current president, and you get your stimulus check, and I think it's trying to garner some goodwill with the voting public by distributing this money, right? It sort of reminds me of like the high school elections, right? So the class president, free Cokes for everybody at lunch, and the vending machines will be free. This is sort of the federal government's version of that. Hey, we'll give you $1,000 if you have a kid that's born, again, between December 1st, 2025 and December 31st, 2028. So basically, while Trump is in office, that's why I guess not surprisingly called it a Trump account. But, it is what it is. And if you can take advantage of it, why not? And then I think, again, get with your financial advisor to see if contributing, up to that $5,000 annual limit makes sense for you personally. But, from what I remember hearing and what I've read is that these are akin to like a Roth IRA or can be converted to a Roth IRA in the future when the kid, I guess, gets older than 18 or whatever. So, don't quote me on that, but that's definitely something to do some research. But I think it is similar to that. So from that standpoint, you're setting them up with, the compounding interest is huge, over someone's lifespan. So if you're setting them up with a retirement account, right when they're born, by the time that they retire, it could be, if you're contributing the maximum each year, more than $100,000 in that account, which could be significant, especially if the markets continue to perform well. So yeah, that's interesting, and it could be something where, again, if you're in the boat of having substantial royalty income, you want to pass that on to the next generation. You have kids or grandkids that meet the criteria. Could be a way to allow some of that after-tax royalty income to grow tax deferred, and for you to gift it to that child. And again, obviously, there's gift tax, limits and all those types of things that need to be considered. But kind of an interesting new option for folks that want to take advantage of that.
Yeah, you said it, Matt, and it's an interesting type of account because, like you said, it's an IRA-based account. However, they can use these certain restrictions related to IRA withdrawals at the age of 18. So it's really offering adults a chance at, some money provided to them that has grown while they were kids. And this is a lucky group of kids, I would say, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I remember, so kind of if you happen to have like a great aunt, right? So I had a great aunt that when she passed away, I think gave me $500. And I was, 1 or 2 years old. And by the time I was 18, that had grown to several $1,000s. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. I'm going to college. I have some money to help offset the costs and expense of college and things like that. So that was, it's kind of like Uncle Sam acting as your great aunt or great uncle. Good option there if you can take advantage of it.
All right, so Matt, so carbon sequestration is something that was absolutely promoted in the bill. And so it's one sector that benefits under the law. The 45Q tax credit has been retained in the value increase for capture with utilization or enhanced oil recovery. And that's an interesting change, Matt, something I was unaware of, but they weren't allowed to use this tax credit when used for enhanced oil recovery. Before, it was only for sequestration.
Yeah, this is, I think this is huge because there is an actual beneficial use when you take carbon dioxide, let's say out of a coal-fired power plant or whatever the source is, and you inject it down into a well and push more oil and gas out, you actually are getting a direct economic benefit from increasing the oil production from that field or from those wells that are impacted by that. Enhanced oil recovery is what that is called, which what Justin's referring to, where they inject either water or in this case CO2 down hole and allowed to produce more oil. So this is huge. So before you used to have to direct air capture or capture that CO2 and then just eject it into a formation where it wouldn't escape. There was no use from that CO2. It was just sequestered, right? It was just pumped underground and then left there in perpetuity. And what this does is allows those tax credits that exist under that 45Q tax credit scheme to apply to enhanced oil recovery projects. So if you own minerals in like West Texas is a great example because there's a lot of mature conventional oil plays that have utilized, enhanced oil recovery in the past, and it could open up for additional enhanced oil recovery projects because they can take advantage of these tax credits to help offset the capital investment required to build the pipelines and injection wells and all of those types of things to inject the CO2. And there is, I think, an environmental benefit there. Obviously you could argue that by producing more oil, that's going to burn more CO2, but you're also, storing a lot of that CO2 under the ground. Not all of it comes back up with the additional oil. So there there's kind of a win-win there, I think, in terms of, an actual benefit. It's actually doing something besides just sitting there on the ground. It's actually helping you produce more efficiently from existing wells. So that means, in my mind, that's a environmental benefit, because you're not having to drill additional wells in new areas to get that additional production. You can take advantage of the fact that when we produce oil from most wells, we're only getting, maybe up to like 20% on the high side of the oil that's in place. And so by doing these enhanced oil recovery projects, you can, extend the life of those wells. You can increase that recovery efficiency, and it's a benefit to obviously the companies that are investing in these projects, that are getting return on investment, and then also for the mineral and royalty owners. If you had those declining wells that were just trickling along and kind of the tail end of their life, and the operator comes in and decides to do an enhanced oil recovery project, it could be a huge benefit. Production could go up quite a bit and stay fairly stable over a long period of time. So, yeah, it'll be really interesting to see, does this spur operators to invest in new EOR projects? I think it might, if the economics, work out. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this develops.
You said it, Matt. And along with some of the changes in that area, the IRA, the previous bill, had put new restrictions on methane and new taxes related to methane. And those taxes that were due this year has been deferred to 2035. And I'm going to assume that's likely a way or in a hope that those will actually be able to be completely written off by 2035. But that's a substantial amount of money that, is instantly back on the balance sheet, at least for now, for these operators. So it creates a really interesting and very favorable environment for them. They've now got extra cash. They've got less expensive way to go about doing their operations. And there's some other small things that I'm sure were huge benefits. For instance, drilling permits are valid for 4 years versus they were shorter periods. Streamlined approvals for federal and private mineral production. Not all of the streamlining was approved by Congress, but some aspects were, some aspects weren't. And then elimination of expression of interest fees, which, Matt, you might know better what that is. But that was basically, this was for nominating federal lands for leasing. So they hadn't even won the contract yet, but essentially the operators were paying to be able to say, I would like to drill on this lands. So that reduces the barrier significantly and makes it less expensive for them to do business.
Yeah, definitely. So clearly a pro-business, clearly pro-oil and gas business provisions in this bill. Now, as far as some of these other things that are kind of interesting in general for business owners and small business owners. So one of the things that it does from a business tax provision is it made permanent Section 199A, the qualified business income deduction. So this allows eligible taxpayers to deduct up to 20% of their qualified business income from pass-through entities. So think of like a partnership or an LLC. So if you happen to manage your mineral rights through a business entity like an LLC, this particular provision might actually benefit you as well. And so whereas before it was set to expire, this makes it permanent. And so it means that you can, look at the ways that you calculate your adjusted taxable income from the purposes of this interest deduction limitation. And so you might be able to deduct more of those interest expenses because of some of the changes that they made. So I think this is a really interesting thing, because in the past, you kind of were hit twice, right? If you're self-employed and you have an LLC, you had to pay self-employment tax, your portion basically and the company's portion of the FICA and all that kind of stuff. So now it allows you to deduct, percentage of that through those qualified business income deductions. And so, yeah, really interesting here. And it may be a benefit, again, if you have minerals in an LLC and use that structure. And again, if you meet the criteria, according to the law of the land here, and, just give it to your CPA and they can help advise you. But it could be, a direct benefit to those mineral and royalty owners that use those types of entities to manage their interests as well.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. It's some major changes. And I'm sure, Matt, there's things that have happened in this bill that we're not even talking about. But it had a big impact on energy across the board. So one of the big takeaways was wind and solar power were very much incentivized in the last administration, in the last bill. And that has kind of been leveled. So the wind and solar power, they have to have the projects placed in service by the end of 2027 to take advantage of the tax credit that was promised by the previous bill, or start construction by July 4th, 2026, and enter service by the end of 2030. Any projects outside of that scope, that tax incentive is no longer offered. And there were some other changes with like battery storage, geothermal, and nuclear. They fared a little bit better under the new law. They retain the full tax credit eligibility for construction beginning up to the end of 2033, 75% in 2034, 50% in 2035, and then 0% thereafter. So it'll be interesting to see in the energy world. I mean, it's big changes across the board. Even coal had a reduction in their royalty rates, a commitment to lease sales, and a new tax credit for metallurgical coal production. So this bill, Matt, was huge. And we spent a lot of time prepping before the show trying to fact check and check different aspects. But what are some of the other key takeaways, Matt, that you took from the bill?
Yeah, I think for me, I was glad to see that they did not slash the main incentives for nuclear power. I think that's really the path forward long term. Decades or centuries from now, we need to be using significant amount of nuclear power. And I think that it was originally threatened, to remove those cuts during the negotiations, despite there's generally bipartisan support for the industry, I think. And finally, when they put the final draft on this, it did allow some of the primary incentives that were established under the Inflation Reduction Act to stay in place, which I think is good. One of the things is it does put some restrictions on certain types of existing nuclear power plants in terms of tax credits, and then the credits for new advanced nuclear technology, such as small modular reactors, remains in place, phasing out after 2032. So that's really not that big of a time period when you think about how long it takes for these nuclear power plants to get approved and permitted. But I think what they're trying to do is streamline the process for permitting these small modular reactors that are a lot safer than older, previous generation technology. So that's good to see that those incentives for nuclear power generally remained in place. One of the losers was hydrogen. So the clean hydrogen that had some tax credits that were introduced in the IRA, that's being phased out. So basically, only if projects begin construction before the end of 2027 will they be able to benefit from that. And previously, it was available up to the end of 2032. So that was shortening that time period. Of that, it's largely, I would say, more experimental technology. It's not really something that's widespread and maybe going to have as big of an impact as nuclear power on reducing carbon emissions. But yeah, I think overall, I think we covered almost everything else as far as the main takeaways from the mineral and royalty owner perspective. And I think, thinking forward, I think it does present a good opportunity to review your estate plan, review your tax planning with your CPA and with your financial advisors, just to make sure that you're taking advantage of all of the benefits from this new OBBA, and see what you might be able to take advantage if you aren't taking advantage of it. Things like the Trump accounts, if you just had a child, or things like that. Things to look into for sure.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. It'll be really interesting to see how the industry reacts. Time will tell, and I'm curious to see. The operatives have been on a let's maintain a consistent, cautious growth path. Let's not get pulled into a boom or bust cycle. And everything in this bill could easily create very much a boom on the oil and gas side. It'll be interesting to see what oil and gas operators decide to go for that. A few years ago, Matt, there was this controversy with Shell, and I believe it was the Dutch government made them divest some properties and limited their growth. I wonder how that'll play into this. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next 3 years.
Yeah, for sure. And one last thought. We talk about the federal impact. I think again, if you own private minerals in your federal lands, this is a big benefit to you. And to that end, they're also looking at accelerating the whole NEPA review process. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, and what that is basically the environmental review process for permitting new projects on federal lands. And they're looking to totally overhaul that. And in fact, they have a voluntary fee for service option where basically you can pay an additional fee to streamline or expedite the permitting process. So it's kind of like, if you want to pony up, we'll look at it first. So it's kind of an interesting concept, and it'll be interesting to see, are they actually going to follow up and actually be able to turn around those permits in those reviews in a more expedited time period. In the past, the federal government has been, glacially slow in those types of reviews. It takes, years to get the approval for these large projects. And so it'd be good to see them streamline that process and make it more fit for purpose, because I think it just, over the years, it had gotten so bloated and cumbersome that it just took forever to get completed. Now, obviously, you want to still maintain a level of environmental scrutiny over these projects. You don't want to give companies free rein to do whatever they want, but you need to have a kind of a well-oiled machine in place so that companies know how long to expect to get permits turned around or to get these environmental reviews turned around. And, if there's a provision to expedite it, well, that's, good. Remains to be seen if that actually can be put into action, though.
You said it, man. It'll be interesting to see. Yeah, the rig count will tell.
The rig count will tell. And I guess the parting shot here is if oil prices go crazy, then, all bets are off from what we're talking about. But assuming oil prices sort of stay where they're at, I think this could be really beneficial for mineral and royalty owners. And again, there's some kind of interesting things here, just depending on your financial situation and some of these other provisions that affect you, whether you own minerals adjacent to federal lands or not. So yeah, more to come. And thanks again for listening. And again, we'll link to all of the resources we mentioned in this episode in the show notes, which can be found at mineralrightspodcast.com. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.